Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the web-based series Knowledge for Accountability. This series is organized by UNDP in partnership with Executive Magazine, thanks to the support of the European Union and the government of Denmark. Today's episode is about Lebanon's standing on international anti-corruption indicators and what it should do to improve that standing, drawing on comparative experiences, particularly the experience of Denmark, which is a global leader in the field of anti-corruption and a country that leads the international anti-corruption indicators, particularly Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. I am pleased to host in today's episode Ambassador of Denmark in Lebanon, Madam Merete Juhl, and Mr. Ghassan Moukheiber, who is an activist and a former member of parliament and an expert in the field of anti-corruption, governance, and human rights. Corruption has been a long-standing problem in Lebanon that was one of the driving forces behind its current situation and the current economic and fiscal crisis and the worsening socioeconomic situation for the Lebanese. Moving forward requires a focus on anti-corruption and a systemic solution to this systemic problem. Today's session is going to hopefully shed some light on what could be done to achieve that goal. My first question is to you, Ambassador, and I thank you again for joining us in this important discussion. Ambassador, Denmark has been a long-standing partner for Lebanon and an active member of the international community. How does Denmark and yourself as ambassador in this country see the impact of corruption on the Lebanese and the importance of this agenda for the efforts to help this country recover and rebuild its future?
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, which allows me to highlight that the fight against corruption is indeed, in our view, a key battlefield, because Lebanon, unfortunately, is among the most corrupted countries in the world when we look at the International Transparency Index. And from our experience, the Danish experience, we are at the other end of the index, effectively addressing the issues of corruption is a key to development in general of a prosperous and well-functioning society. So I'm totally convinced that the efforts to combat corruption successfully is also a key to actually overcoming the fundamental challenges that Lebanon is experiencing, because the mismanagement and the corrupted, deeply rooted structure prevents the very necessary reforms and developments of the country. So I believe it's a very important agenda, and I'm happy that Denmark is among the countries taking a leadership approach in trying to assist Lebanon in this important battle.
So as a leading person who has been at the heart of this effort to strengthen Lebanon's anti-corruption legislative framework, through your background in civil society, in parliament, and also as an expert in the field, how do you see the evolution of anti-corruption efforts in Lebanon? Is it moving in a good direction? Is it something that you see progress being made? And do you see that the progress being made is up to the expectations of both the Lebanese society, but also the international community and Lebanon's partners?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Definitely, Lebanon is at the bottom of the indicators, and Denmark is on the top. And we are meeting at two extremes. The Lebanese have a worse perception of corruption than the index. And the index may be fluctuating, and it has been used and useful, I could say, in showing the authorities how bad the situation is. And it has gone, from my experience in the early 90s, from total denial. And I remember when we were establishing the Transparency International organization in Beirut, we were rejected from even delivering the documents on two grounds.
Rejected by?
By the Ministry of Interior. And they said, first, there's no corruption, so why bother? And second, you are individual citizens. Why do you want to organize to fight corruption? We've gone from that extreme of a government and authorities that don't even recognize corruption to authorities that focus so much on corruption that the most corrupt make long speeches about corruption. And this multiplies the frustration of the Lebanese. But there is a major change that has happened, is that it has moved from a minority of intellectuals working within organizations to the masses. And particularly in the uprising of the Lebanese 3 years ago, fighting corruption has become a major demand, a major popular demand. So it's gone from elitist to mass request. It has gone into institutions. And we may be talking about that a little later, but I can see that change happen. However, the frustration is still there because there are no results. There is a way out, and I believe that the Lebanese are not seeing that way out from the tunnel. The international community will help because that realization of the Lebanese that fighting corruption is important will come with pressure, with additional pressure, because the Lebanese realize that their own internal efforts to plan and to pressure the authorities have created some advances, some improvement, but not enough to give them results.
Other than the important transition that you highlighted from denial of the problem to recognition of the problem, from this being a technical discussion in closed rooms to this becoming a very important characteristic of the public debate, do you see at least some encouraging progress towards the achievement of results?
Definitely. I said that there were no results. We have seen advances in good planning, particularly a strategy to fighting and preventing corruption that was voted by the government in 2020. Yes. I believe that this strategy is a very good way forward, and it took 11 years to be put in place. That was not something that was simply done or simply decided. However, that's an area where both Lebanese efforts and international efforts need to meet. And within the Lebanese effort, a combined efforts of multiple stakeholders, what I would call the alliance of integrity in Lebanon. There are good people and bad people everywhere. And I think that the good members of the judiciary, of parliament, of the executive, of civil service, and of civil society need to coalesce. And from experience, it is that coalition that helped some breakthroughs that we've seen.
Thank you, Ghassan. I'd like to come back to you, Ambassador. And Ghassan mentioned different elements of success that need to be supported. So looking at Denmark, which is a global leader in the area of governance in general, but also in the area of anti-corruption, as evidenced by different international indices that measure anti-corruption. So looking at Denmark, what are the main elements or the main components of Denmark's recipe or Denmark's success story?
Yes. I believe there are several elements that made it possible to reach where we are in Denmark or in this field. The key elements, first and foremost, there's a culture that corruption is unacceptable, and there's also a very high level of awareness, identifying if there's any issue at stake. Secondly, transparency is a very dear value, and it's broadly implemented in our society. And then also we have strong mitigation measures and enforcement mechanisms to actually push back and punish people who take corrupt measures. To elaborate on the culture, there's this very strong sense that every child in Denmark is brought up with to respect the common good and not to steal from
as part of the education system?
Yes, this is part of the education system, but also very strongly represented in the social norms, in the homes, the way kids are brought up. So I'm quite sure that is a fundamental component. So people hold each other to account. They check on each other because someone is cheating. Corrupt measures will be at the expense of the common good. So that, I think, is a very strong fundamental value that has taken, of course, time to develop. But we are talking about a democracy that is basically dates from 1849 when we had our democratic constitution. So, of course, we've been on a long journey as well. And there's this strong sense of public justice where also the media, of course, is very strong. They follow up. We have, I think, for the outside world, quite spectacular cases of ministers who had to leave their job because they bought some beers or a little bit of clothes on the government card as opposed to paying with their own card. They faced a huge scandalization and criticism from the public because this is unacceptable in the public eyes. And we have also done a lot on transparency, of course, free media, but also an important law in this field, access to information from public institutions. So the media journalists have by law the right to access documents and public processes and policy making, which of course will expose any corrupt processes or any irregular steps. So that is indeed instrumental. So we often have these cases coming up because the free press would dig and expose the corrupt behaviors. So that's instrumental in the case of Denmark as well. And the same goes for mitigation measures, so that should there be cases of corruption, we mitigate it, we prevent it from happening, hopefully, with the public procurement procedures, tender measures that are really regulated in details. And then, of course, the punitive measures, an independent judiciary, and also it's quite preventive on people that they know their reputations will be ruined. Someone who commits or takes corruptive measures will be maybe out of business or out of politics forever, depending of the degree. So that indeed regulates people's behavior, and then of course financially if they are punished. So all these measures are important. I think in all fairness, it should also be mentioned that we have a high living standards, high level of salaries. So no one will be in the situation where he or she cannot provide for his family or her family without corruption. So that I think is a framework condition as well that should in all fairness not be overlooked. And then of course the fight against corruption never ends. We as society and not least economic transactions develop in the modern world and also international transactions and digitalization, we are faced with new challenges that we need to address, and that results in new policy making in Denmark and strict follow-up. So,
thank you so much, Ambassador. With that said, and those different elements, culture, transparency, law enforcement, etc., what can Lebanon learn from that experience? What are things that we can maybe learn from Denmark?
Let's look at comparisons first. Madam Ambassador started with the element of culture. And going back to what corruption is, putting it simply, corruption is abuse of office for personal gain, personal interest. And this is not acceptable in a state that provides itself for public funds and redistributes public funds through effective institutions. This is totally different in Lebanon. because the very definition of corruption is exactly what politicians in Lebanon are expected to do. And this is why we call corruption in Lebanon systemic. It is systemic because the definition of corruption, not only is it not accepted, it is accepted, but is required for a person to become a leader. So electors and individuals require their leader to abuse office for their personal gain. And rather than the state with its institutions redistributing the funds that are provided to the state through taxes, citizens evade taxes, leaders help them evade taxes. They suck the funds to their own profit and redistribute those funds, retaining enough of these funds and public goods to allow them to remain in authority to help. This clientelistic system is totally different from whatever
and
we
what
see
about,
in
what
an
about the
effective
elements
state.
on transparency, media? Do you see?
I will get to that. I'm starting by it's not only a cultural matter that can be resolved by lectures or by classes at school. It has to do with the way the system operates.
Absolutely.
And as I described it, the politicians and the citizens that have turned into clients expect their leader to act in a corrupt manner, because that's how the system operates. The way out is to create effective state institutions that provides the services to the citizen without that expectation from both the politicians and the citizens of getting into corrupt system. And this is what is reflected in the strategy. It is not stated in so many words, although in its preamble, the National Strategy on Fighting Corruption is the only document I know, official documents, that qualified corruption in Lebanon as systemic. It does reflect the analysis, which is the diagnosis of the ailment we face. Now, yes, and exactly as you said in Denmark, the tools for preventing and fighting an ailment are those four that you mentioned. Public culture, education, transparency, that's the whole concept of preventing corruption, oversight, maintaining tools to put the politicians and people in office under permanent pressure, including through public opinion and the media, and the fourth and the most important element, which is holding them to account. Because it has been said in a very short way, the only way to fight corruption is to make the cost of corruption higher than the benefit. There are always benefits of corruption, but the system in Lebanon is fraught with ineffectiveness all the way. We don't have systems for changing that culture that is caused by the systemic political environment we live in. Second, we don't have the appropriate tools for transparency. We do not have effective tools in oversight, and we do not have effective tools for holding to account. And we have been working, including the strategy, is a roadmap to correcting all of these ailments and get us to effectiveness on these four grounds.
We discussed the problem, the issue. We looked at the story, the success story in Denmark. We kind of distilled what we can learn from that experience. We compared it to what's happening in the country, in this country, in Lebanon. But the question that everyone probably is thinking, okay, other than this good discussion and important discussion, which helps to exchange experiences, how is Denmark currently helping Lebanon in its effort against corruption? What is being done? What are you doing as Denmark, as a partner of Lebanon? But also, in your opinion, what more could be done by the international community to support anti-corruption? And what do you expect from Lebanese decision makers in this regard?
Denmark is currently supporting the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. This is done through our partnership with the UNDP. Denmark and the European Union are main donors. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the UNDP and the Minister of State Reforms for their commitment in this field. And I'd also like to take note of some of the recent positive developments in Lebanon. the mere adoption of the anti-corruption strategy in last year is a very important milestone. Notably, the strategy was developed by the Lebanese, and this was done in consultation with civil society, and the strategy is in line with international standards. This means that we now have a strong framework and can focus on the, of course, challenging implementation, but at least the framework is there. I think another important step in terms of implementation is the establishment of the Anti-Corruption Commission, which is set to play a leading role. Of course, it cannot stand alone and be responsible for the fight against the corruption in Lebanon, but it is an important body in the framework. And then, of course, I think we went through the comparison and where we can maybe share lessons learned and where there are fundamental differences, but the Danish experience, I hope, can be taken as inspiration. And we went through the elements that where did we come from, where have we reached to. They will be the same here, but of course have to be addressed in the context. Firstly, the experience from Denmark suggests that fighting against corruption requires this change of culture in all elements of public institution and in the private sector as well. We were covering it already, but that indeed is fundamental. And then what can you expect from us, from the international society in that regard? Well, we will be reiterating the need of a strong commitment by the whole government to work on this. It's a top-down as well as a bottom-up effort. Every minister has to say, look, this is the anti-corruption strategy. How will we implement it here? This exercise has to be taken very seriously and be a priority for it to be possible to reach implementation on the ground. I think that is really a key point. High-ranking public officials, for example, director generals, have an important role in adopting anti-corruption measures. They have to walk the talk and encourage this cultural change and
within their administrations.
Within their respective administrations and institutions. And the same goes in the private sector. This is where it starts. The walking of the talking is implementation on the ground. And secondly, we need to ensure to improve the transparency. We also touched upon it. And likewise, proactive in this regard, proactive disclosure of information. That sharing information has to be part of a cultural change, I think. Having been here almost 4 years as an ambassador, I think I dare to say it's not always part of the culture to proactively disclose information, but I think that is key as well, that considering this information a public good that has to be shared upon request and as stated in the law. And another important aspect of transparency is, of course, free media, that the media can fully operate and access information. And this is also an area where Denmark, among others, cooperate, for example, with Samir Kassir Foundation. It's a key value-free media for us, so we have the ambition to contribute on this as well in Lebanon. And then thirdly, mitigation measures should be strengthened. An example where the government could and should act swiftly is ensuring full implementation of the public procurement laws. Also, ministries and public institutions could conduct trainings for public service on anti-corruption measures to explain what does it mean in the day-to-day work to work according to anti-corruption measures. And then fourthly, law enforcement needs to be strengthened. The independence of the judiciary is key, obviously, which has also been reflected in our conversation here today. And because without a well-functioning and independent judiciary, the necessary punitive measures will not be enforceable. Goes without saying. So we expect the Parliament, and we'll advocate for that, to swiftly adopt the long-pending independence of the judiciary law. It remains really key. And make sure that it's in line with international standards as well. I think it was an important thing to keep in mind, that if the laws are designed to basically avoid change, then it doesn't.
You'd have the title, but the content would
and
be
it doesn't
missing.
get us where we want to go. And our good colleagues from the European Union have on many occasions offered support for this development of the law. So we hope that will be received and implemented accordingly. And finally, I'd like to highlight that the fight against corruption goes hand in hand with economic recovery. That's a precondition for really being able to work towards a future with no corruption or much lower scale of corruption to improve the living conditions. This is critical for public servants and other people that are exposed to corrupt practices. And this leads me to my final and perhaps most important expectation for decision makers in Lebanon. We need to see the swift adaptation of reforms. We said it many times, but this is also to fulfill the conditions of the IMF package that will help Lebanon develop towards a more constructive and prosperous future. So that goes hand in hand with the combat of corruption to put the country on a financially and economic recovery journey.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador. So Denmark is walking the talk, because you mentioned Denmark is supporting the implementation of the strategy, supporting organizations that work on free media, but also playing an advocacy role. You know, in conclusion, what do you see, Mr. Moukheiber, as the immediate priorities that could be useful to take the next step into the right direction?
I think there should be priorities on the three axes that we spoke about. The one on transparency and prevention of corruption, the one on oversight, and the third on holding to account. And on each one of these fronts, there are priorities. And I also would like to bring another image that I'd like to leave with the auditors and with the viewers, as we're talking about a vicious cycle in Lebanon. And what we need is the contrary of vicious cycle.
Virtuous.
As we live in a vicious cycle in Lebanon, we're looking for a virtuous cycle. The proper of the cycle is that it's complete. Everything seems interlinked, but there is a dilemma. Where do we start? We start everywhere. And I like to provide the image of a puzzle rather than a pyramid. We tend to believe that there are actions that are more important than others, including security and stability and sovereignty, that on which you can base a strong parliament, and the parliament that delivers a good government, and so on. I believe from practice that our priorities is anything we can do immediately. And we can build the image of a virtuous state as the image of a puzzle.
Where you put
whatever is available, we should put it in. We have finished part of it, but a lot remains to be done, both in law and enforcement.
Are there any immediate pieces, if taking your analogy of a puzzle, that is being kind of filled out with the right pieces?
Yes.
Are there any particular pieces that you see important or could be prioritized in the immediate future?
Immediately, on the first front, importance of implementing access to information and proactive transparency. And second, in the main context of prevention, providing appropriate rules for conflict of interest and rules related to appointments in civil service, because these areas are extremely prone to corruption, in addition to an appropriate implementation of public procurement law, which is a huge element of grant corruption in Lebanon. On the front of oversight, developing parliamentary oversight. With the election of new parliament, this parliament needs to beef up its capacity to be the overseer of the executive in policy making and in law enforcement. Second role is a newcomer for oversight, which is the National Anti-Corruption Institution. This institution needs to be strengthened, provided with capacity, because it has an extremely important role to play on several areas, and it's a novel institution that can provide the citizen with hope that with new people and new authorities and new powers, one can achieve. On the third level, which is holding to account, it has become, I think, accepted that reforming the judiciary is critical. And we need to understand that it's not only the judiciary that needs to be reformed for accountability, it's also the effectiveness of parliament. Not only criminal courts, but courts of disciplinary courts and financial courts, making sure that the parliamentary control on public finances is made effective through budget, the budgetary cycle, and through the study, analysis, and approval of our final state accounts, which had never been appropriately studied nor voted for the past 50 years.
50.
Yeah, no, 50 years.
I mean 50,
which is
not 15.
الحسابات القطعية للدولة اللبنانية. So these are my set of priorities, but there are many others that probably are of less of an importance in these sectors, but every action needs to be implemented, including, and most particularly, I think, developing the actors. Projects cannot be done without appropriate people, and we need, in my opinion, the number one priority is create and reinforce the coalition between internal civil society organizations and actors and international community, and creating better synergies as exists with UNDP, which has been extremely instrumental, not only now, but early on, since the 1990s, in following up on those efforts, I would say relentlessly. I believe that there's something about the trait we should never lose faith that we can succeed. And I think abandoning the efforts is the worst enemy now in Lebanon, because we see the Lebanese are tired, they are poor, they don't know where to go. And we need to give them hope with action. And why not with some people behind bars?
Thank you so much, Ghassan, for highlighting the opportunity, for highlighting some important immediate steps. And I think as a person who's worked in this field, this has been very insightful. It's from your practice, so that's much appreciated. Maybe we can go to final words on your side, Ambassador Juhl. I think so far, and it has been a very rich discussion, from highlighting the success elements in the Danish story, the reason why Denmark today is a global leader, but also what Denmark is doing to support Lebanon. What are things that could be done? What are your expectations from the Lebanese decision makers, and putting it all in a package and linking it to economic recovery and economic reforms. Important messages, but maybe it's also would be helpful to hear from you, because you are also coming to the end of your tenure in Lebanon as ambassador very soon. What would be your final words to the Lebanese on this important agenda of reform, anti-corruption?
First and foremost, I think it's important that this conversation takes place, and it reflects that anti-corruption is high on the agenda, and it's broadly recognized. Touched upon earlier that this is something people recognize as a key challenge and problem in Lebanese society that hinders, prevents a constructive development, because corruption is systemic and has to be addressed. And As mentioned, the measures, the national anti-corruption strategy, the laws that are in the pipeline, the work is in preparation. It has to be done. It has to be carefully implemented, and with good people keep pressuring and following up, and with continuous support from international society community. I think you can count on that from us. I also hope that the commitment and the will to take this long journey will stay in place, because, as you say, as you also just stressed, the case of Denmark, it's not been a short journey. It has taken very long to get a tailor-made a system in place that suits our society model, and likewise it will take time here, but the first important steps are taken, and I'm uplifted with the discussion here today, and with knowledgeable people keeping to make an effort in cooperation with civil society and pressuring the decision makers. I think this is the track to be on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It has been a pleasure to have this discussion, and dear viewers, as you know, this is part of a series of discussions on different topics. Today's discussion has focused on the overall progress in Lebanon in anti-corruption and how it compares to what is expected by the international community to improve Lebanon's position on international indicators, drawing on experiences, particularly the Danish experience, which is a particularly relevant experience if we are to talk about international anti-corruption indicators. We have covered a lot of ground, and I have Ambassador Juhl to thank and Mr. Moukheiber to thank for a very rich and insightful discussion, and indeed an uplifting discussion, because without the commitment of different actors, progress will not be possible. And it is thanks to this commitment that we learned more about today, that Lebanon is making progress, slow but sure, I think, on the anti-corruption, in hope that it can accelerate and results can become more visible, and regular Lebanese citizens on the street can start feeling these results. Thank you very much. And dear viewers, please do join us in the next series, in the next episodes of this series, so that we can continue the discussion on anti-corruption as a priority for Lebanon.